Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing Canadian sanctions against Russia. Now, Marcus, there are Russian companies that operate in Canada. Some are large and economically significant. For example, companies that produce material used by the Trans Mountain Project, and they have ties to oligarchs. So what are the consequences for companies like that and for the employees who work there?
Yeah, you're right, Christine. Evraz Steel is one of the largest Russian companies operating in Canada today. They own 5 steel processing plants in Regina and in various different cities in Alberta. And what those plants do is they process various types of steel and make the material that's used in oil pipelines. It's hard to tell what the long-term impact of these sanctions will be on the employees that work at Evraz. It's unlikely that there will be any sort of negative impact. I don't think anyone is interested in shutting down these plants or watering down the value of those assets. I think in the very worst case scenario, what might happen is if Canada does actually pass this piece of legislation that's making its way through the Senate right now, the Repurposing of Frozen Assets Act, those Russian assets that are locked up in Evraz Steel, they may be sold off to another entity, a Canadian entity, some other multinational entity. But it's pretty clear that those factories themselves, those steel processing plants, will remain in place, and the workers that work there will not be losing their jobs. And the same goes for any of these other Russian-owned companies that are operating in Canada right now. I think the jobs will remain in place in the long term.
Sean, I want to get your take on the impacts of these sanctions on Canadian businesses. What do you think the major impact will be?
Businesses that have a minority Russian shareholder are in somewhat of a precarious situation. And you need to look at it from both a Canadian perspective and a global perspective. From a Canadian perspective, our sanctions, quite frankly, are drafted in broad terms, and we haven't had any interpretive guidance from global affairs. Despite requests for that. This has left them in a situation where there is uncertainty as to whether or not sanctions may or may not apply. Compared to other jurisdictions, for example, like the United States, which has very clear rules, for example, a 50% rule, where if a shareholder owns more than 50% of a company, that company will be designated or deemed to be a sanctioned entity itself. Canada does not have that type of guidance, so we're in sort of an unclear situation. Although I would agree with Marcus that to date we've seen statements from the Prime Minister at a press conference, similarly from Premier Scott Moe, that these sanctions are not applicable to them. And we have, of course, not seen any enforcement today. So somewhat of a precarious situation, but from a Canadian perspective, what we see to date is a non-application.
Professor Leyte, I want to touch on something that Sean just said, which is about how Canada's sanctions on Russia compare to those imposed by our allies like the European Union or the United States. Are we stricter? Are we less strict? How would you sort of compare us to those other jurisdictions?
My impression is that we are roughly consistent with the policies of our major NATO allies. That being said, there are some sort of complexities to these economic measures against Russia that differ from country to country. One interesting development in the United States is a move in Congress to actually seize the frozen assets of Russian oligarchs, which I think is consistent with sort of the generally more aggressive position of the U.S. with respect to economic measures against Russia over the years, and its strong use of sanctions in general. The other point that maybe should be brought out is that what we refer to as sanctions are only really one aspect of the kinds of economic issues that we're now grappling with as an alliance. So, for example, both Germany and the United Kingdom have come under pressure to reassess certain aspects of their economic relations with Russia, which are really not applicable in the same way to Canada, or at least not to anything near the same degree. So in the German case, that, of course, is their extreme dependence on gas from the Russian Federation, which is brought to Germany by pipelines. They were already essentially compelled under extreme pressure to relinquish one project that was near completion, the Nord Stream 2 project, but they remain under pressure from Ukraine as well as other NATO governments. And I would be interested to know about what Canada is saying in private about this to reduce more quickly or essentially to embargo Russian gas sales. There is a somewhat different but related set of issues in the United Kingdom, in that London is, of course, Europe's and one of the world's leading financial centers, and it's become a hotbed of Russian dirty money.
It's certainly sort of famous for that, I think. We've got to go to commercial break, but we will be right back.